My name is Sarah. I'm 25 years old and I'm currently working on my master's degree in clinical psychology. It's ironic, really spending years studying how the human mind works, learning to understand complex family dynamics and psychological trauma, yet I completely failed to see what was happening in my own family. Perhaps we're all blind when it comes to our own stories. I remember the day my world started to shift, though I didn't know it. At the time, it was 3 years ago, just after I'd been accepted into the graduate program. I was sitting in my grandmother Eleanor's kitchen, the familiar scent of tea filling the air. Knowledge is the one thing they can never take from you, she told me, her weathered hands wrapped around her teacup. Education first. Always. Those would be among the last pieces of advice she'd ever give me. 2 weeks later, she was gone. A sudden stroke that left no time for goodbyes. The funeral was a blur of black clothes and murmured condolences. I stood beside my mother, Linda, as distant relatives and family friends filed past. My sister Megan spent most of the service scrolling through her phone, occasionally glancing up to ensure others noticed her designer morning outfit. It was a week after the funeral when my mother called a family meeting. We gathered in our living room. Dad in his usual armchair, Megan sprawled across the sofa, me perched on the edge of a dining chair. Mom stood by the fireplace, her pose reminiscent of a corporate CEO addressing shareholders. Your grandmother left everything to me, she announced, her voice steady and authoritative. The house, the savings, and the apartment building. She wanted me to handle everything. She paused, making eye contact with each of us. I know this might seem surprising, but your grandmother trusted my judgment. I raised my hand. Hesital, an old habit from years of careful conditioning, but Mom didn't Grandma ever mention anything about inheritance to us. She always talked about family legacy. The look she gave me, that mixture of pity and irritation I'd grown so familiar with over the years, should have been my first warning sign. Sweetie, these things are complicated adult matters. Your grandmother made her decision, and we need to respect that. I watched in the fall following months as changes began to unfold. Megan suddenly started carrying the latest iPhone and posting Instagram stories from luxury boutiques. Mom and Dad announced they were taking a much-needed vacation, 2 weeks touring Europe's fashion capitals. Meanwhile, I was picking up extra shifts at the campus cafe, trying to save enough for graduate school supplies. Then came what seemed like a blessing. I was in my final semester of undergrad, planning my transition to graduate school, when Mom approached me with what appeared to be a solution to my housing concerns. I've been thinking, she said one evening, her voice casual, but her eyes calculating. You know, the apartment building your grandmother left me. Why don't you rent one of the units? I'll give you a special rate, much lower than market value. I did my research. The rent she was asking was indeed almost half of what similar apartments in the area were going for. It seemed perfect, too perfect. I realize now. Of course, we'll need to do this properly, Mom insisted, pulling out a stack of papers she'd already prepared. A formal lease agreement, everything documented correctly. I'm very particular about these things. She smiled, that confident smile that had always meant she was in control. I always do things by the book. I signed the papers that evening, my signature careful and deliberate beside hers. I remember feeling grateful, adult-like, responsible. I had no idea I was signing away my own inheritance. The apartment was beautiful. Hardwood floors, large windows, a small balcony, perfect for morning coffee. I filled it with secondhand furniture and textbooks, proud of creating my own space. Between classes and shifts at the cafe, I managed to make it feel like home. My routine became a carefully choreographed dance: wake up at dawn, attend classes, rush to work, study until my eyes burned, sleep for a few precious hours, repeat. The rent took a significant portion of my cafe earnings, but I was making it work, or at least I thought I was looking back. Now I can see the signs I missed. The way Mom would smile when I thanked her for giving me such a good deal on the rent, how she'd lecture me about responsibility while I handed over my hard-earned money, the satisfied look in her eyes when I'd tell relatives about how I was managing on my own, paying my own way through graduate school. That's the thing about family dynamics, they're like water shaping us so gradually we don't notice how our edges are being worn away. It's only when something disrupts the flow that we finally see the patterns that have been there all along. I didn't know it then, but everything was about to change. The careful life I built, the relationships I thought I understood, the truth I thought I knew, it was all balanced on a foundation of lies that was about to crumble. But that's getting ahead of the story. First, you need to understand how it all fell apart piece by carefully constructed piece, how a family can smile in your face while stealing your birthright, how the truth can hide in plain sight until something as simple as falling books brings it crashing down around you. I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning, or rather from the moment everything started to unravel. It was a Thursday evening, and I had just finished a particularly grueling shift at the cafe. I had no idea that when I opened my apartment door, I would be taking the first step toward destroying everything I thought I knew about my family. Graduate school had always been my dream, but dreams I was learning come with a price tag. Every day was a careful balancing act between my academic pursuits and financial survival. I'd wake up at 5:30 a.m., spend 2 hours reviewing research papers and working on my thesis before heading to campus. By 9 a.m., I'd be in the psychology department's research lab running experiments or analyzing data for my advisor's latest study on family trauma and resilience. The irony of my research focus wouldn't hit me until much later. Between classes and lab work, I'd rush to the cafe where I worked the afternoon shift. The manager had been kind enough to give me a flexible schedule that worked around my classes, but that meant I often ended up with the busiest hours. My feet would ache from hours of standing, serving endless streams of customers who barely looked up from their phones as they rattled off complicated coffee orders. You're working too hard, my advisor, Dr. Martinez, commented one day after catching me nodding off during our weekly meeting. Maybe you should consider taking fewer shifts at the cafe. I smiled tiredly, not bothering to explain that the rent and utilities for my discounted apartment ate up most of my earnings. I'm managing, I assured her, the same response I gave everyone who noticed the dark circles under my eyes or my increasingly worn appearance. The truth was I was barely keeping my head above water. Every month was a careful juggling act to rent, utilities, groceries, textbooks, lab fees. I'd learned to survive on free coffee from the cafe. My one luxury was the occasional phone call to my grandmother's old friend, Mrs. Liu, who would tell me stories about how Grandma Eleanor had worked 3 jobs, determined to build a better life for her family. Your grandmother was a fighter, Mrs. Liu would say, her voice crackling over the phone. She never took the easy way out. Those conversations gave me strength, made me feel connected to the grandmother who'd always believed in me. But life has a way of throwing curveballs just when you think you've got everything under control. That Thursday evening, I just finished a particularly brutal shift at the cafe. 3 large groups had come in right before closing, and one customer had spent 15 minutes berating me because her non-fat, sugar-free vanilla latte wasn't vanilla enough. All I wanted was to collapse on my couch and maybe review some research papers before bed. Instead, I opened my apartment door to find my sister Megan sprawled across my couch, scrolling through her phone as if she Own the place, 2 large designer suitcases sat beside her, and shopping bags were scattered across my carefully organized living room. I stood in the doorway, keys still in hand, trying to process the scene before me. What are you doing here? Megan barely glanced up from her phone. Oh, hey, she said, as if this was completely normal. I'm moving in with you. Mom said was fine. The casual way she delivered this bombshell made my head spin. What do you mean moving in? This is my apartment. I pay rent here. She rolled her eyes, a gesture she'd perfected since childhood. Don't be so dramatic, Sarah. Mom owns the place and she said I could stay here. It's not like you're using all this space anyway. You're never even home. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone and called our mother. Each ring felt like an eternity as I watched Megan continue scrolling through her social media, completely unbothered by the chaos she just introduced into my life. Mom, what's going on? I demanded when she finally answered. Megan says she's moving in here. Is she going to pay rent? To the response I got hit me like a physical blow. Are you crazy, Sarah? Mom's voice was sharp, that tone she used when she wasn't going to tolerate any argument. What kind of stupid questions are you asking? Of course Megan's not paying rent. You'll keep paying what you've been paying, and she'll live there for free. That's not fair. The words bursted out before I could stop them. If she's living here, she should pay half the rent. I can barely afford. Listen to me carefully, Sarah. Mom cut me off, her voice dropping to that dangerous quiet that had always meant trouble when we were kids. That apartment belongs to me, and I decide who pays what. If you don't like it, you can move out right now. The threat hung in the air between us. Move out in this area, regular rent would be almost double what I was paying now. My graduate stipend and cafe job barely covered my current expenses. There was no way I could afford market rates. Well, Mom's voice dripped with satisfaction, knowing she had me cornered. What's it going to be? I looked at Megan, still sprawled on my couch now, watching me with a smirk. I thought about my research, my degree, everything I'd worked so hard for. Fine, I said finally, the word tasting like ash in my mouth. She can stay, good girl, Mom said, as if I were still 5 years old. I knew you'd be reasonable about this. After hanging up, I spent an hour researching rental listings in the area, but everything was way out of my price range, so I swallowed my pride and accepted the situation, telling myself it was temporary just until I finished my degree. But living with Megan was like having a tornado as a roommate, a tornado with no concept of consideration for others and an unlimited credit card. Every morning I'd wake up to find lights blazing in empty rooms, the kitchen, the living room, even the hallway. She'd leave them on all night. Every night. Megan, could you please remember to turn off the lights when you leave a room? I asked one morning, trying to keep my voice level. The electricity bill. Oh, stop being so uptight. She cut me off, not even looking up from her phone. It's not that big a deal, but the lights were just the beginning. The real nightmare was her bathroom habits. Megan would lock herself in there for hours, lally hours, taking endless baths while chatting with her friends on the phone. The sound of running water became the soundtrack to my anxiety. One evening, while trying to prepare for an important exam, I could hear her splashing and laughing through the bathroom door. The water had been running for over 2 hours. Hey, Megan, I called out, knocking on the door. You've been in there forever. Do you realize how much water you're wasting? Her voice came back, muffled but irritatingly cheerful. Chill out, sis. I'm having a spa day. Mom says I can do what I want. I retreated to my room, trying to focus on my textbooks while calculating the probable cost of these spa days in my head. When the water finally stopped running, 3 hours had passed. The day the utility bill arrived, I nearly fainted. The amount was double what I usually paid. Double. I stood in the kitchen staring at the numbers, wondering how I was going to manage this on top of my other expenses. That evening I tried to confront Megan. She was sprawled on the couch, feet up on the coffee table, watching videos on her phone at full volume. We need to talk about the utility bills, I said, holding up the paper. They've doubled since you moved and you need to be more conscious about the water and electricity usage or what? She finally looked up, a smirk playing on her lips. Or you'll need to help pay the bills. I finished, trying to sound firm. Or you'll need to find somewhere else to live, she countered, sitting up straight, her eyes narrowing. Mom specifically said I can do whatever I want here. You're supposed to be grateful. Remember, that's what Mom said. The conversation devolved from there, each of us retreating to our corners of the apartment, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. That night, I lay awake in bed, listening to the sound of running water from another of Megan's midnight baths, wondering how my life had spiraled so far out of control. Sometimes the biggest moments in our lives come disguised as accidents. For me, it was a stack of falling books that changed everything. I'd been organizing my bookshelf after another exhausting day, trying to create some sense of order in at least one part of my life, when I slammed the bookcase door shut in frustration. Several thick books I hadn't noticed on top came crashing down, hitting me squarely on the head. Perfect, I muttered, rubbing the sore spot. Just perfect. That's when I noticed something flutter to the ground, a piece of paper that had fallen out of one of the books. I bent down to pick it up, thinking it was probably just an old receipt or a forgotten bookmark, but as I unfolded it, my heart stopped. It was a legal document, clearly photocopied, but still perfectly legible. At the top, in bold letters, it read, "Last will and testament." My grandmother's name was right there, along with the date, just a few months before she died. My hands started trembling as I read through it. And there it was, in black and white. My grandmother had left money to my mother and Megan, but this apartment, this very apartment I'd been paying rent for, had been bequeathed to me. I sank to the floor, the will still clutched in my trembling hands as memories came flooding back. Everything started making horrible sense now, like pieces of a puzzle I'd been too blind to see. My mother's voice echoed in my head. From that day, right after Grandma's funeral, I remembered sitting in our living room surrounded by relatives as Mom made her announcement. Mom left everything to me, she'd said, her voice steady and convincing. All the property, all the money. She wanted me to handle everything. She'd looked around the room, meeting everyone's eyes with such sincerity that no one questioned her. I remembered raising my hand timidly, like a school girl afraid to ask a stupid question. But, Mom, why didn't Grandma leave anything to us, to Megan and me? The look she gave me, that mixture of pity and irritation, was burned into my memory. Sarah, these things are complicated. It was your grandmother's decision, and we need to respect that. You just have to accept it. Accept it. Those words hit differently now. I understood the money they were spending so freely, the shopping spree, the European vacation, all those expensive gifts for Megan that had been Megan's inheritance. They'd spent it right in front of my face, probably laughing at how I never questioned it. And this apartment, my apartment, they hadn't just hidden it from me. They'd made me pay for it: monthly rent, utilities, everything. I'd been working my fingers to the bone at that cafe, stretching every dollar while living in a place that was legally mine. The bitter irony of the lease agreement hit me like a slap in the face. I could practically. She spread the documents on the kitchen table, the same table where she'd made me sign that rental agreement so many months ago. The irony wasn't lost on me. Sarah, honey, she said softly, pushing the papers toward me. I know I made a terrible mistake. I'm asking for your forgiveness. Please don't be angry with me. We can put this behind us. And I cut her off by sliding another document across the table, the demand letter my lawyer had prepared. You have 2 weeks to pay back the $60,000 you took from me. The moment my mother finished reading the demand letter, all pretense of remorse vanished. She leaped up from her chair with such force it crashed to the floor, and then the screaming began. "You ungrateful little witch," she shrieked. "How dare you do this to your own mother?" The sound echoed off the walls so violently that I swear I saw bits of plaster dust drift down from the ceiling. The neighbors must have thought someone was being murdered. I forced myself to stay calm. "You can scream all you want, Mom. It doesn't change anything either. You pay what you owe me, or I'll file a lawsuit. Think about it: fraud charges, legal fees, your reputation in the community, your choice." She stormed out of the apartment, slamming the door so hard that pictures rattled on the walls. I could hear her stomping down the hallway, still screaming. I thought that would be the end of it for the day. I was wrong. The calls started coming within the hour. First it was my father. "How could you do this to us?" he demanded. "After everything we've done for you, you're an ungrateful and scrupulous child." I let out a bitter laugh. Ungrateful and unscrupulous? That's rich coming from parents who tricked their own daughter into paying rent for an apartment she owned. Where was your conscience when you were cashing my rent checks every month? He spluttered something about family loyalty, but I hung up. Next came Megan. "You're going to ruin everything," she wailed. "If Mom and Dad have to pay you all that money, they won't be able to pay for my college. Is that what you want to destroy my future?" "Your future isn't my problem, Megan," I replied coldly. "Maybe you could try what I did. Get a job, work hard, save money." Novel concept, I know. The calls kept coming. Mom would alternate between screaming and crying. Dad would lecture about family duty and respect. Megan would guilt trip and manipulate. They took turns tag teaming me from morning till night. Sometimes they'd call from different phones when I blocked their numbers. After a week of this, my father called with a different tone. "We need more time," he said, his voice heavy. "Can you give us a month instead of 2 weeks?" I considered it. The lawyer had advised me that a month was still reasonable. "Fine, 1 month, not a day more." But exactly 1 month after my mother's meltdown in my kitchen, I checked my bank account. There it was, $60,000 transferred in full. It's been 3 months since the money appeared in my account. My aunt Diana called me last week. She's always been the family gossip, but for once I was grateful for her need to share information. "Your parents had to take out a bank loan to pay you back," she told me, her voice a mixture of concern and fascination. "They're really struggling with the payments now." I sat on my couch, my grandmother's couch, listening as she continued. "Megan's not in college anymore. They can't afford the tuition." She paused, probably waiting for me to show some sign of guilt or remorse. "She's just sitting at home, complaining about how you ruined her life." I thought about Megan, who had never worked a day in her life, who had always expected everything to be handed to her. Maybe it's time she learned to stand on her own feet, I said. Please feel free to comment below if you like this article. Remember to like and subscribe for more.